800 years after Christ, a Norwegian farmer named Thorvald watched the sun sink below the horizon and felt his shoulders tense. Not from cold, though February in Trondheim could freeze breath in your lungs. Not from exhaustion, though he had spent 12 hours repairing the roof of his longhouse. No, Thorvald tensed because sunset meant transformation. His peaceful farmstead would become a fortress, he would become a warrior, and his children, sleeping near the hearth, would need to survive another night in a world where darkness meant death. This was Scandinavia before the Viking raids, before the longships touched foreign shores, before the world learned to fear the Norse. But here is what the chronicles rarely tell us: before Vikings terrorized Europe, they terrorized each other. In the endless forests of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, winter darkness lasted 20 hours, summer never truly slept. And in that liminal space between light and shadow, Scandinavian families faced a nightly battle for survival that would forge the most formidable warrior culture in European history. Every night. The longhouse rose like a wooden island in a sea of danger, 60 feet long, 20 feet wide, with walls made from logs as thick as a man's torso. Thorvald's grandfather had built it. His father had strengthened it. Now Thorvald carved protective runes into every new beam, following patterns the village elders remembered from the old ways. These were not decorations, they were prayers. Desperate hopes carved into wood. But here is what the sagas do not explain: why these runes, why these specific patterns, why every elder across Scandinavia seemed to know the same protective symbols, despite living in isolated valleys, separated by weeks of dangerous travel. 30 souls lived in Thorvald's hall, grandparents who remembered when winters were colder and raiders more numerous, parents who worked the fields and trained for war. Children who learned to distinguish between wolf howls and human war cries before they learned to read. Thralls who had lost their own families to raids and now defended the household that enslaved them. Free servants who traded their swords for food and shelter. Every person had a position. Every position had a purpose. The women controlled the internal defences with iron discipline that would impress any Roman legion commander. Thorvald's wife, Sigrid, orchestrated the sleeping arrangements each night. Grandmothers with the keenest hearing slept nearest the doors, their ears trained by decades to distinguish the crunch of friendly feet from hostile tread. Warriors positioned at strategic points throughout the hall, close enough to support each other, far enough to prevent a single breach from killing them all. Children in the protected center, near the precious seed grain and the silver hoards buried beneath sleeping benches. The central hearth fire could never die. Never. Not just for warmth, though without it the family would freeze in hours. Not just for cooking, though empty bellies make poor defenders. The fire could never die because darkness meant death, and flame kept more than shadows at bay. On the night of February 7th, in the year 793 after Christ, 30 raiders struck Thorvald's hall during a blizzard. Visibility dropped to arm's length. The world became white chaos, howling wind, and the crunch of boots on snow. But Thorvald had prepared. The Norwegian elk hounds gave the first warning. Raised from pups to distinguish family from stranger, their barks changed pitch when unknown men approached. Then came the cacophony of geese stationed around the perimeter, a defensive innovation Thorvald had adopted from a trader who claimed Eastern emperors used the same system. Geese made better sentries than dogs. They never slept. They attacked strangers with genuine fury, and their screams could wake the dead. Sigrid moved first. While Thorvald grabbed his axe, she roused the household with practiced efficiency. No panic, no screaming, just calm commands that sent everyone to positions they had rehearsed 100 times. Grandmothers herded children toward the center. Thralls overturned the heavy sleeping benches to create barriers. Free servants secured the back entrance and murder holes in the roof. The raiders hit the main door like an avalanche. Thorvald and his 3 sons held the doorway, not from heroism, from geometry. The door was narrow, only 2 men could enter at once, and a defender with his back to family fights with a ferocity that attackers, who can retreat, cannot match. The battle lasted 6 hours. 6 hours of screaming darkness, 6 hours of axes rising and falling, 6 hours where every heartbeat might be the last. The historical record preserves the outcome. Thorvald's hall survived. But here is what the sagas do not tell us. Here is where the story becomes strange. Thorvald's defensive innovations spread through kinship networks across Scandinavia within months, across hundreds of miles of dangerous territory, through dozens of isolated communities that rarely communicated. Families began adopting the same techniques, the same dog and goose warning systems, the same overturned furniture barriers, the same murder holes cut through roofs at identical angles. How? There were no books. Literacy was rare. Winter travel was suicidal. Yet the knowledge spread like wildfire through wet forest. Some historians suggest travelling skalds carried the tales. Others point to the thing gatherings where families met to settle disputes. But here is what troubles me. The spread was too fast, too uniform, too perfect, as if someone, or something, wanted these families to survive. The victory came at a price recorded in scratches on a stone near Trondheim that archaeologists discovered in 1972. 2 of Thorvald's sons died. The hall was half-burned. 23 of the 30 attackers were killed. Their bodies left where they fell until spring thaw allowed for burial. But the family survived. The seed grain survived. The silver survived. And Thorvald gained a new name that appears in fragments of sagas, Nightwalker, a man who had defended his hall against darkness itself. But here is what the records do not tell us. Why did Thorvald's grandson, mentioned in the sagas as Bjorn Ironside, become one of the most legendary Viking raiders in history? What did he learn from his grandfather's defensive stand? And why do the skaldic poems hint that Bjorn never attacked a defended longhouse, despite his reputation for ruthless aggression everywhere else? The Longhouses rose like wooden islands in seas of danger. Families of 30 souls crowded into single halls where the central fire could never die. Women orchestrated defences with military precision. Children learned that night meant transformation. This was Scandinavia before the raids. This was the crucible where Vikings were forged, not on foreign shores, not in glorious battles against distant kingdoms, but in the terrible mathematics of defending a wooden hall against darkness, hunger, and neighbours who wanted your food, your silver, your land, your lives. And every night, as the sun set and shadows lengthened, families like Thorvald's tensed their shoulders and prepared for transformation. Because in the endless forests of the north, where winter darkness lasted 20 hours, survival was not about heroism. It was about lasting until dawn. Between 800 and 950 after Christ, something changed in Scandinavia. The longships returned from raids carrying more than silver and slaves. They brought enemies, blood feuds that stretched across oceans, revenge seekers who remembered which village had sent the raiders who killed their brothers, burned their monasteries, enslaved their children. The Vikings had taught Europe to fear the darkness. Now, darkness followed them home. In Denmark, King Godfred issued a decree in 810 that would reshape Norse society more than any battle. Every family must maintain weapons equal to their wealth. Not a suggestion, a law. Inspectors travelled from farmstead to farmstead, counting silver and counting swords, and families found wanting paid in land, status, or blood. The decree created an arms race. Rich families built stronger defences. Stronger defences required more resources. More resources meant richer families pulled further ahead. Poorer neighbours faced a choice: submit to protective alliances, or die alone when raiders came calling. Protection became currency more valuable than silver. A skilled defender could command higher bride prices than a merchant's daughter with twice the dowry. Warriors who could hold a doorway for 6 hours earned claims to better farmland than farmers who had worked the same soil for generations. A new aristocracy emerged, based not on blood or age or wisdom, but on a single terrible skill, the ability to keep families breathing through the night. But here is what the chronicles do not tell us. How many families chose wrong? How many proud farmers refused alliances, trusted in old defences, and simply vanished into the historical silence that marks the dead who leave no children. The transformation accelerated in 871 after Christ with what the sagas call the Battle of the Burning Hall. The name appears in 3 separate sources. The details conflict wildly, but the core story remains consistent, and it centers on a woman named Astrid the Clever. Astrid was married to Eirik Bloodaxe, a raider whose reputation for violence extended from Dublin to Constantinople. While Eirik was busy earning his name in Ireland, slaughtering monks and burning villages, Astrid was home near modern Bergen, pregnant with their 4th child, managing the household and preparing for the inevitable. Because here is what Astrid understood that the sagas never quite explain. Every successful raider makes enemies, every enemy remembers, and enemies always, eventually, come home to collect their debts. 40 revenge seekers arrived on a June night when the sun barely set. Men from 3 different families, united by a single purpose: kill everyone in Eirik Bloodaxe's hall and burn it to ash. They expected to find a woman heavy with child, a handful of servants, perhaps a few farmers with hunting spears. They found a fortress. Astrid had spent 2 years preparing, 2 years of modifications that she disguised as routine repairs, 2 years of training her household in techniques that the sagas describe but do not explain their origin. Murder holes cut through the roof at precise angles, allowing defenders to thrust spears downward at attackers below. The holes were disguised as smoke vents. The spears were stored in the rafters, invisible from below, positioned for quick access. Iron cauldrons of lead heating over the central fire, ostensibly for roof repairs that never seem to finish. But lead melts at 327 degrees. And molten lead poured on human flesh does things the sagas describe in detail too terrible to repeat here. False walls creating killing zones where invaders became trapped. The walls looked structural, they held up nothing. They existed solely to funnel attackers into spaces where defenders held every advantage. When the raiders broke through the main door, Astrid's serving women poured molten lead from above. The screams carried for miles. While raiders scrambled backward, blind and burning, Astrid's teenage sons thrust spears through prepared slots in the false walls. The raiders who survived the entrance found themselves in a maze of barriers and murder holes, fighting enemies they could not see, dying in a wooden building that had become a weapon itself. 23 attackers died inside the hall. Their screams established a new principle that spread through Scandinavia faster than any law or decree. The longhouse itself must become a weapon. But here is where the story becomes strange. Within 5 years, longhouses across Norway, Sweden and Denmark incorporated the same modifications, the same murder holes at the same angles, the same false wall configurations, the same prepared positions for spears and cauldrons. The spread was too uniform, too perfect. Some historians credit traveling craftsmen who shared techniques for profit. Others point to winter gatherings where successful defenders shared their secrets. But here is what troubles the careful observer. These families were enemies. They raided each other. They nursed blood feuds that lasted generations. Yet they shared their most valuable secrets, the innovations that kept their families alive. Why? What force could compel bitter enemies to arm their rivals with life-saving knowledge? The innovations multiplied and evolved with terrifying speed. Families developed specialized night-fighting techniques passed from parent to child in whispered lessons after dark. How to fight in complete darkness using the hall's familiar geography. Where to store weapons for quick access in any emergency. How to create improvised barriers from everyday objects, overturned benches, stacked grain sacks, even the bodies of the fallen positioned to obstruct doorways. Children learned these lessons before they learned their letters. Because literacy was optional, survival was not. The economic burden grew crushing. Families invested 40% of their wealth into defense. 40%. Money that could have bought better tools, more livestock, additional farmland, went instead to specialized craftsmen who created increasingly elaborate defensive systems. Hidden passages connected longhouses to outbuildings, allowing families to flank attackers or escape if overwhelmed. The passages required expert construction too narrow, and defenders could not move quickly, too wide, and attackers might use them to infiltrate. The ideal width, it turned out, was exactly 22 inches, narrow enough to defend, wide enough for rapid movement. How did every craftsman across Scandinavia arrive at exactly 22 inches? Trapdoors dropped raiders into pits lined with sharpened stakes. The pits needed precise depth, too shallow, and raiders might climb out, too deep, and they filled with groundwater. 7 feet became the standard. Exactly 7 feet, from Bergen to Stockholm to Copenhagen. Weighted nets, suspended from rafters, could entangle groups of intruders. The nets required specific knot patterns that would tighten under weight, but could be released quickly by defenders who knew the secret. The same knot pattern appeared across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. Intelligence networks emerged that rivaled anything in Christian Europe. Successful defenders shared techniques through winter gatherings, while desperately guarding secrets from potential enemies. But which secrets should be shared? Which held back? Families developed elaborate systems of partial knowledge, teaching enough to create allies, withholding enough to maintain advantage. A family in Denmark might learn about murder holes, but not their optimal angles. A family in Norway might discover false walls, but not how to construct them for maximum effect. Everyone had pieces. No one had everything. Except here is what the evidence suggests. Someone did have everything. The archaeological record shows fully optimized defenses appearing simultaneously across vast distances. Not partial implementations, not experimental variations, perfect execution of complex techniques, as if someone had provided detailed plans. Women managed these systems with remarkable efficiency. They maintained detailed mental maps of which families owed defensive obligations to others. Who could be trusted in specific situations, where old feuds might prevent assistance, which neighbors would answer horn calls and which would pretend not to hear. This knowledge was never written down. It could not be. Writing meant evidence that enemies could capture, secrets that could be stolen. So women memorized everything. Hundreds of families, thousands of obligations, decades of feuds and alliances, all carried in memory, passed from mother to daughter in quiet conversations, while men trained with weapons. The serving women who poured molten lead in Astrid's hall were not warriors. They were mothers and daughters and sisters who understood that survival required everyone. The teenage sons who thrust spears through murder holes were children 5 years earlier. The transformation from child to defender happened faster than modern observers can comprehend. Because there was no childhood in the modern sense, there was only the period before you could hold a weapon and the period after. The transition came early. It had to. By 900 after Christ, every longhouse in Scandinavia operated under the same terrible logic. Defense consumed everything: wealth, time, childhood, peace. Families lived in a state of permanent preparation for violence that might come any night or never come at all. The psychological toll appears in the sagas as madness, berserker rage, mysterious illnesses that made warriors incapable of sleep. Modern readers interpret these as metaphor or exaggeration, but here is what the evidence suggests. These people were traumatized. Generations of them. Living under constant threat, sleeping in shifts, training children to kill before they could write their names. What does that do to a society? What does it create? It creates Vikings, the most formidable warrior culture in European history. But here is what the sagas do not explain. What came first? Did the violent culture create the need for elaborate defenses, or did the elaborate defenses create the violent culture? And here is the deeper mystery that historians avoid. Who benefited from keeping Scandinavian families in a state of permanent warfare? Who gained from communities that produced generation after generation of warriors trained from childhood to kill efficiently and without hesitation? The Longhouses became fortresses. The fortresses became weapons, and the families who survived passed their techniques to children who would use them not just for defense, but for conquest. The same murder holes that protected halls in Norway would appear in Viking fortifications from Ireland to Russia. The same night-fighting techniques that saved families from raiders would terrorize monasteries across Europe. The transformation was complete. Scandinavia had become a forge, and what emerged from that forge would reshape the medieval world. The 10th and 11th centuries marked the apex of Viking home defense, when every longhouse operated as part of vast defensive networks stretching across entire regions. Individual heroism mattered less than systematic preparation. Personal courage meant nothing without community coordination. And the greatest defenders were not the strongest warriors, but the families who understood that survival required thinking beyond their own walls. The sagas call it the Three Nights of Thunder. It happened in 988 after Christ, near what would become Oslo. The Sigurdsson family compound, not a single longhouse but 5 connected structures housing 120 people, across 3 generations faced 200 attackers from 3 rival clans, seeking blood vengeance for raids that had killed their fathers, brothers, sons. The defenders were outnumbered almost 2 to 1. By conventional military logic, they should have died. But the Sigurdssons did not think conventionally. Underground tunnels connected all 5 longhouses, not crude crawl spaces but engineered passages tall enough for armed men to move at a run, wide enough for 2 defenders to pass each other, reinforced with timber to prevent collapse even under the weight of burning buildings above. The tunnels allowed defenders to shift rapidly between buildings. When attackers concentrated on the eastern longhouse, defenders melted away through underground passages and emerged from the western building to strike the raiders from behind. When the western building came under assault, defenders vanished and reappeared to the north. The attackers found themselves fighting ghosts, wasting energy on battles that evaporated before they could achieve breakthrough. Pre-positioned supply caches meant no single structure needed to hold everything vital for survival. Weapons in every building, food in multiple locations, water stored underground where fire could not reach it, medical supplies distributed across the compound. The Sigurdssons could lose any single building and still maintain full defensive capability. But here is what the sagas do not explain. The tunnels required years of excavation, hundreds of man-hours of digging, shoring, concealing. The work would have been obvious to anyone who observed the compound. Yet the attackers seemed unaware the tunnels existed. As if the Sigurdssons had somehow prevented reconnaissance, or the attackers had simply ignored obvious evidence. The 3 Nights of Thunder established new principles that spread across Scandinavia within a generation. Individual longhouses were obsolete. The future belonged to compound defenses, multiple structures supporting each other, families binding together into larger defensive units that could withstand assaults no single hall could survive. Communities developed sophisticated early warning systems. Horn calls carried specific messages across miles of forest and farmland. 3 short blasts meant wolves dangerous but not catastrophic. 1 long note signaled human raiders, the threat that required immediate response. Complex patterns identified which family needed aid and from which direction danger approached. A family under attack from the north would sound a specific rhythm: long, short, short, long. Neighbors hearing that call would know not just who needed help but which route to take, which weapons to bring, which defensive positions to occupy upon arrival. The system required everyone to memorize dozens of signals. Children learned horn calls before they learned to count. Fire signals relayed information across vast distances in minutes. Beacon towers positioned on high points could communicate simple messages visible for 20 miles or more. 1 fire meant warning. 2 fires meant urgent danger. 3 fires meant the message should be relayed farther, expanding the defensive network until hundreds of warriors might mobilize before raiders could strike isolated farmsteads. But here is where the historical record becomes strange. These systems required central coordination. Someone had to standardize the signals. Someone had to ensure every community used the same horn patterns, lit fires in the same sequences, responded with the same protocols. Yet Scandinavia had no central government, no unified authority. No institution capable of imposing such uniform practices across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. So who coordinated the signals? Who taught the patterns? The sagas are silent. The archaeological evidence suggests the systems appeared almost simultaneously across vast regions, as if materializing from nowhere. Women managed these communication networks with remarkable efficiency. They maintained detailed mental maps of which families owed defensive obligations to others, who could be trusted in specific situations, where old feuds might prevent assistance. When horn calls sounded in the night, women made split-second decisions about which neighbors to summon and which to avoid, balancing desperate need for help against the risk that supposed allies might use the crisis as an opportunity for betrayal. Because here is what the sagas rarely admit. The greatest danger did not always come from strangers. Sometimes the families who answered your call for help decided your silver was worth more than your friendship. Sometimes neighbors arrived to defend your hall and left having claimed it for themselves, explaining to authorities that they found everyone already dead when they arrived. Trust was the scarcest resource, more valuable than weapons or silver or land. And women allocated that resource with ruthless precision, deciding in moments of crisis who might save you and who would definitely kill you. The spiritual dimension of protection reached its peak as families layered physical and supernatural defenses. Every threshold received daily blessings from women who remembered the old ways even as Christianity slowly spread across Scandinavia. Weapons hung over doorways carried runic inscriptions promising death to uninvited guests. Families buried silver coins at cardinal points around their properties to create protective circles that raiders supposedly could not cross. The runes carved into door frames and support beams followed patterns that modern scholars cannot fully decipher. Some symbols clearly represent Thor's hammer or Odin's ravens, others resemble no known runic alphabet. They might be protective prayers. They might be territorial markers. They might be something else entirely. Because here is what troubles linguists. The same unknown runes appear across Scandinavia, in the same positions always on the eastern doorframe, always at exactly eye height, always oriented in the same direction, as if every family had received identical instructions from a source that left no other trace. Psychological warfare intensified, as defenders cultivated reputations for supernatural protection. Families spread stories of cursed doorways that struck raiders blind. Berserker defenders who could smell enemy blood from impossible distances. Ghosts of fallen ancestors who fought alongside the living during desperate sieges. The stories were not entirely fabrication. Archaeological evidence suggests some families did use chemical weapons, burning certain plants to create smoke that caused temporary blindness and disorientation. Some defenders did display extraordinary sensory awareness, likely the result of heightened alert states combined with intimate knowledge of their environment. And some raiders did report seeing additional defenders who appeared and vanished inexplicably, though whether these were actual ghost sightings or simply fear-induced hallucinations remains unknown. The beliefs became self-fulfilling prophecies. Raiders avoided families with the strongest reputations, concentrating attacks on those perceived as spiritually vulnerable. Families without supernatural reputations faced more frequent raids, suffered higher casualties, and often collapsed within a generation. Families with powerful spiritual defenses could go years between attacks, allowing them to accumulate wealth, strengthen physical defenses, and build even more intimidating reputations. But here is the uncomfortable question. If supernatural protection was just reputation and psychology, why did the effect persist across generations? Why did raiders from distant regions, who had never heard the stories, still avoid certain halls? What were they sensing? The Golden Age produced innovations that would influence military architecture for centuries. The concept of layered defense, multiple walls, multiple buildings, multiple backup positions appeared in European castles built by Norman descendants of Vikings. The murder holes that protected longhouses became machicolations in stone fortifications. The false walls and hidden passages of Scandinavian halls influenced castle designs from Scotland to Jerusalem. Military historians credit these innovations to Viking raids, assuming Norse warriors learned from the castles they attacked. But the archaeological record suggests the opposite. Viking home defences predated most European castle innovations by 50 to 100 years. The Vikings did not learn from castles. Castle builders learned from Vikings. How? The same question that haunts this entire history. How did knowledge spread so efficiently across hostile territories, linguistic barriers, and political divides? How did innovations appear simultaneously in locations with no apparent contact? How did families who should have been killing each other end up sharing defensive techniques that kept them all alive? The Golden Age was golden only in retrospect. For families living through it, every day brought crushing economic burden. Every night brought potential violence. Every generation grew up expecting to die defending their homes. Children who survived to adulthood were already veterans of sieges most modern soldiers never experience. Women who reached old age had killed more men than most warriors. This was not a society, it was a survival mechanism, efficient, ruthless, and ultimately unsustainable, because the same forces that made Scandinavian families impossible to conquer also made them impossible to govern, impossible to unite, impossible to transform into anything other than what they had become, a culture built entirely around violence. The great mystery is not how this system emerged. Constant threat explains that. The mystery is why it worked so well. Why generations of families, acting independently, made decisions that benefited not just themselves but the entire network. Why bitter enemies shared life-saving knowledge. Why the whole of Scandinavian defense became greater than the sum of its parts. As if some force beyond individual families or clan loyalty or shared culture, was guiding the process. Ensuring survival, shaping a people, for purposes no saga ever explains. After 1066, after Christ, when William the Conqueror's Norman Vikings conquered England and Christianity's cross replaced Thor's hammer across Scandinavia, the age-old system of family-based defense crumbled within 2 generations. Not from foreign invasion, not from military defeat, but from something more insidious, centralized authority that promised protection while demanding submission. The transformation began subtly, almost invisibly. Christian priests condemned pagan protection rituals as demon worship, the daily blessings at thresholds, the runic inscriptions over doorways, the silver coins buried at cardinal points, all of it, the priests declared, invited demonic forces rather than repelling them. Families who had defended themselves for centuries suddenly found their most powerful weapons. Their spiritual defences declared not just worthless, but actively dangerous. Norwegian King Olaf Tryggvason led the campaign with particular ferocity. He travelled from district to district, offering families a choice: accept Christ and destroy your pagan protections, or face royal punishment. The punishments were creative. Families who refused baptism found their fields burned, their livestock slaughtered, their trading privileges revoked. But Olaf was clever enough not to destroy the families themselves. Dead families paid no taxes, compliant families did. The kings demanded that weapons previously stored in longhouses be surrendered to royal armories. The justification sounded reasonable: centralized weapon storage would allow faster mobilization for defense against foreign threats. But here is what the policy actually meant. Families who had kept swords and axes within arm's reach now had to request permission to arm themselves. The time between horn call and armed response stretched from minutes to hours or days. Raiders noticed. Attacks increased. Families who had surrendered their weapons died. And the promised royal protection arrived too late, or not at all, because kings had their own priorities and defending isolated farmsteads ranked low compared to consolidating power and collecting taxes. Some families resisted, not openly, which would have invited immediate destruction, but quietly. They claimed to have surrendered all weapons while hiding the best blades beneath floorboards. They accepted Christian priests while maintaining pagan rituals in secret. They dismantled obvious defenses while preserving hidden passages and murder holes. These families became known as Old Believers, though the term appears in sources only as insult and accusation. They maintained every ancient protection ritual, the sacred fires that could never die, the runic doorways that promised death to invaders, the weapon benches concealed as ordinary furniture. They attended church on Sundays and invoked Thor on Tuesday nights. They paid Christian taxes and offered pagan sacrifices in forest clearings far from priests' eyes. But here is what the historical record suggests. The old believers were not rebels or holdouts from a dying age. They were the families who survived. Because while Christianity spread and royal authority consolidated, the fundamental reality of Scandinavian life had not changed. Darkness still fell. Raids still happened. And families still faced nightly threats that no distant king could prevent. The last great stand of traditional defenders occurred at Trondheim in 1095 after Christ. 7 families refused King Olaf's demand to demolish their defensive fortifications. These were wealthy families, powerful families, families whose ancestors had held the region for generations. They believed their status would protect them. They were wrong. King Olaf arrived with 300 soldiers. The 7 families, 140 people total, retreated into their interconnected longhouses and activated defences refined over 3 centuries. Murder holes cut through roofs at optimal angles. False walls creating killing zones. Hidden passages allowing rapid repositioning. Stockpiled weapons and food sufficient for months of siege. The royal forces attacked on a Thursday morning. Contemporary accounts describe the initial assault as a disaster for the king's men. Defenders poured boiling water from murder holes. Spears thrust through hidden slots killed soldiers who thought they were in safe positions. The maze of false walls confused attackers, separating them from support, funneling them into prepared kill zones. 17 royal soldiers died in the first hour. King Olaf withdrew to reconsider his approach. By evening, he had reached a conclusion that would define the future of Scandinavian defence. He could not conquer these fortifications through direct assault. But he did not need to. Fire. The ancient enemy, the threat every Longhouse family had feared for generations. Royal soldiers shot flaming arrows onto roofs. The defenders extinguished some fires, but not all. Smoke filled the interconnected halls. The sophisticated tunnel systems that had been such an advantage now became chimneys, drawing smoke through the entire compound. The defenders faced an impossible choice. Stay inside and suffocate. Come outside and face 300 armed soldiers. Some chose smoke, others chose surrender. A few chose to fight their way through the royal lines and managed to escape into the forest, though what happened to them afterward the records do not say. After 3 days of siege, the last defenders negotiated surrender. King Olaf granted them their lives, but nothing else. They watched as royal soldiers methodically destroyed defensive innovations that had protected generations. Murder holes filled with stones, false walls torn down, hidden passages collapsed, weapon caches confiscated, runic doorways burned. The 7 families were allowed to rebuild. Simple structures, no defences, no hidden features. Just basic shelters that could house people and livestock and nothing more. They were permitted to survive, but not to protect themselves. The message to all Scandinavia was clear: the age of family-based defence had ended. Protection now came from kings, not from your own preparations and your own weapons and your own willingness to hold a doorway until dawn. But here is what the official histories do not record. The destruction at Trondheim took 4 days. 4 days of soldiers systematically demolishing innovations that represented 3 centuries of accumulated knowledge. Contemporary accounts mention soldiers becoming reluctant, refusing orders, claiming the buildings themselves resisted destruction. Support beams that should have fallen easily required multiple men with axes. Stones filling murder holes mysteriously shifted position overnight. Collapsed tunnels were found partially reopened each morning. Superstition, the chronicles claim. Soldiers seeing things in smoke and shadows. But here is the uncomfortable question. What if the soldiers were right? What if something in those halls did resist? What if 3 centuries of protective rituals, of blood spilled in defense, of desperate prayers carved into wood, had created something that did not want to die? The knowledge did not vanish. It could not. Generations of families had poured their lives into these defenses. Mothers had taught daughters where to store weapons for quick access. Fathers had taught sons how to fight in complete darkness. Grandparents had taught everyone the horn calls that meant help was coming. That knowledge lived in human memory, and human memory is harder to destroy than wood and stone. The legacy of Viking home defense transformed rather than disappeared. It influenced European military architecture in ways historians are only beginning to understand. The murder holes of Viking longhouses appeared in medieval castles across Europe. The concept of layered defense, psychological, spiritual, and physical, influenced fortress design for centuries. The integration of civilian spaces with military defenses became standard in castle planning. Military historians have traditionally attributed these innovations to Crusader experiences or Roman engineering knowledge preserved through the Byzantine Empire. But the archaeological evidence increasingly suggests a different origin. Viking raiders brought more than silver back from their conquests. They brought architectural ideas, and European nobles who fortified against Viking raids learned from the very defenses they attacked. The cultural legacy proved even more persistent. Modern Scandinavian defense doctrine, emphasizing citizen preparedness and home defense over foreign adventures, echoes ancient principles where every family bore responsibility for their own protection. The Norwegian Home Guard, founded in the 20th century, trains civilians to defend their local communities, using principles that would have been immediately recognizable to Thorvald Nightwalker: local knowledge, rapid mobilization, every citizen a potential defender. The Swedish concept of total defense, which assumes every citizen will contribute to national security during crisis, reflects Viking Age understanding that survival depends not on professional armies, but on entire populations committed to protection. The Finnish tradition of universal conscription and widespread weapons ownership traces philosophical roots to those dark nights when families stood watch. But here is what modern Scandinavians rarely acknowledge. These traditions are not just cultural holdovers or historical curiosities. They represent something deeper, a collective memory of what happens when communities lose the ability to protect themselves. The transition from Viking Age family defense to medieval royal authority cost lives. Families that had survived for generations suddenly found themselves vulnerable, dependent on distant powers that might or might not arrive in time. The lesson was never forgotten. Even as kingdoms rose and fell, even as Norway and Sweden and Denmark became modern nation-states with professional militaries and police forces, the underlying principle remained: when darkness comes, when threat arrives at your doorway, the only reliable protection is your own preparation and your neighbor's willingness to answer the call. The last rune-carved doorframe from a Viking Age longhouse sits in the Museum of Cultural History in Oslo. It dates to approximately 1020 after Christ, from the final generation before Christianity fully displaced the old ways. The runes follow patterns that scholars partially understand: prayers to Thor and Odin, promises of violence against enemies, claims of supernatural protection. But along the eastern edge, at exactly eye height, oriented in the precise direction seen in hundreds of other doorframes, is a sequence of symbols that matches no known runic alphabet. Scholars have offered theories: forgotten dialect, decorative flourish, mason's mark indicating the craftsman who carved it. None of the theories are convincing. The symbols are too deliberately placed, too carefully preserved across too many examples to be random or decorative. What were they? What did they mean? Who taught families across Scandinavia to carve these specific symbols in these specific locations? And why did the practice stop so abruptly after Christianity arrived? The doorframe cannot answer. It stands behind glass in a climate-controlled room, silent witness to mysteries that 3 centuries of scholarship have failed to solve. Tourists photograph it daily, students sketch the recognizable runes for their papers, and the unknown symbols remain unknown, as inscrutable now as they were 1,000 years ago. The age of darkness is over. Modern Scandinavia is peaceful, prosperous, among the safest societies in human history. The longhouses are gone, replaced by comfortable homes with electric lights that banish shadow and central heating that makes winter comfortable rather than life-threatening. No one carves protective runes anymore. No one buries silver coins at cardinal points. No one teaches children to distinguish wolf howls from human war cries. But on winter nights, when darkness falls early and wind howls through the forests, some Norwegians still tell stories about halls that could not be conquered, about families that held doorways against impossible odds, about defenses so powerful that 3 centuries later, soldiers claimed the buildings themselves fought back when ordered to destroy them. Just stories now, probably. But here is what the records do not tell us. Why do these stories persist? Why do modern Scandinavians, living in safety their ancestors could never imagine, still tell tales of ancient defenses and supernatural protection? What are they remembering? And more disturbing, what might they be preparing for?